Alright, welcome back. In the last video, we went ahead and we activated the global illumination feature. I went ahead and showed you how to do that, but we ended up with a pretty nasty result. And let me go ahead and do a render region just to show you that. What we end up with is a very splotchy, very nasty scene here. A very nasty effect. So what exactly went wrong and why did Mental Ray do this? Well, the truth is nothing went wrong, and Mental Ray did the exact right thing it was supposed to do. It activated global illumination and went ahead and calculated it. So if you didn't see this and you were still getting a pitch black render, then that means that there's something wrong. But if you get this, this is good. Now this is just a starting point. That's why it rendered so fast. Because the poorer quality, the faster it's going to render. So what we're going to do in this video is go ahead and look at how to improve this render quality. And I'm going to go ahead and show you the parameters that you can use together to get them to work just right, to be able to control the effect and be able to control the quality of the effect, because that's really important. So the easy thing is activating global illumination. The hard thing is being able to control it after you activate it. So we're going to need to open up two PPGs here. Let's go to regions, all options, and let's pin this one down by hitting the keyhole icon up there. And I'm going to be using this area quite a bit, but I'm also going to be using the PPG for my light. So let me go to Explore, let me go to Lights. There's my spotlight. I'm going to select it. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Shader to open up its PPG. And I'll just move that over here to the right. I'm going to pin that one down. I don't want it going anywhere. Okay. And I want to make sure I'm in the Photon tab of the light settings. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is, let me go ahead and move these around a little bit more to give us more space to render out the render region here. Alright, so that looks pretty good. I can expand that a little bit, got some real estate space here. Okay, so how do we control this effect? How do we get it to look good? Well, first let's look at the parameters available to us on the light itself. So on the light PPG we have a Photon tab, and we only get two parameters really that we can control. We can control the intensity, which we can also control the intensity color. We can also control the number of emitted photons from the light. Now in real life, a flashlight or some light source is going to cast millions and millions of light photons, which are so small that you obviously can't see them with your naked eye. You can see the result of it by the lighting that we see outside when the sun's out, or a flashlight lighting up a dark room, but you can't actually see the individual photons with your own eyes because they're so tiny. Okay. Fortunately, in Mental Ray, we can see the individual light photons when they smack against objects in our scene. They sort of just shoot out, smack an object, and get splattered on there and light up the scene. So let's see how that works. Let's go ahead and change the intensity. Right now, default numbers are 10,000 for intensity and the number of photons. Now that may seem like a large number to a beginner to Mental Ray. Once you start getting experience with it and start learning the ins and outs of it, you'll start to realize that those numbers are actually pretty small. And when you work with global illumination in Mental Ray, you're going to get used to working with very large numbers. For example, by the end of a very complex scene, you'll probably end up using millions and millions of these photons. Don't be surprised if you have to use up to 6-10 million to get a good result. Of course, it's going to take longer to render, but we'll look at that in a bit. Let's take the intensity and let's knock it up into the 50,000 range. And you can see that the effect is obviously more intense. It's a lot brighter. Now, we can change the color as well. So we can go to this color box and say change it to green. And our light is going to remain white. But now we're going to have this green tint in our scene because the photons are a different color than the light. So this gives us ultimate control. Now this isn't exactly physically accurate due to the fact that more than likely the photons and the light source itself should have the same exact color. I mean, if you take a flashlight and you put a red color filter over the flashlight, you're going to have red light going into your room. Now the light as well as the photons being emitted from the light are both going to be red. Now, in real life, you could follow that little rule, or in Mental Ray, you get control, and you can actually change the different colors and come up with very fake, unrealistic results, if that's the style or the look that you're going for, and whatever your animation project is. So it's awesome that Mental Ray gives you that ability. Now, and for my sake, I like to go ahead and match up the two colors so that they're exactly the same when I'm working on a photorealistic render. So what I want to do is I want to copy the color of my soft light to the color of the energy from the global illumination. I could do that very easily. All I have to do is left click on this color box, hold down the mouse button and drag, and just drop it right on top of the other color box, and it copies the color automatically. Can't get any easier than that. Okay, so again, this lets me control the intensity, so I can lower it or make it higher. If I go to the max, which is 100,000 that the slider lets me go to, but I want it to be even brighter, I can always overdrive this parameter by going into the numerical field and putting in a higher number. Like if I wanted, say, 200,000. See how I can overdrive that and make it even brighter? And I can just keep going and going and going. Right now, though, I'm going to keep it around the 50,000 range because that actually looks good enough. And then we have the number of emitted photons. Okay, so how does this work? Okay, basically, in layman's terms, the least amount of photons you have, the faster to render because there's less photons for mental ray and your computer to have to calculate. The more photons you have, the better the quality, obviously, because you have more photons flying around in your scene. But the slower the calculation is going to be simply because your computer has to calculate more photons. So, as you can see, when I have a very small number, my result is very disgusting, very horrible, and if I really lower that number, you can start to see the individual photons on the wall itself, which look like these little spheres that are just smacking the walls. They're just bouncing. They come from the light, hit the floor, smack off a wall, smack the ceiling, then maybe hit the floor again, and so on and so forth. So you can see the individual light photons here. Now, if I only have 780, I'm obviously going to have a very disgusting, horrible result, which is unacceptable for a production render. But my render time is extremely fast. It's almost instant, actually. But if I go ahead and increase this all the way up to 100,000, you'll notice that render times are now much, much slower. Okay? But the result is much nicer. Look at this. This looks a lot more realistic and a lot nicer. Yeah, there is some splotching. There is some strange discoloration on the walls and on the ceiling, pretty much on everything. But that can be fixed pretty easily by simply adding more and more photons. Okay, so now that you know what those parameters do, let's look at the parameters here in the main PPG for the mental ray render options under the GI and Caustics tab. Now we have quite a few options here, so let's go ahead and start talking about some of these and how to manipulate them and change them to control the way that global illumination looks in your scene. Now, the first parameter sets here are accuracy. Now we have GI accuracy. By default, it's set to 500, which is a pretty low number, and we can see on the slider it's at the lower end of the slider there. And GI accuracy 500 is going to render a lot faster. Now the way this works is pretty simple. The lower the number, the faster the render, but the more inaccurate the quality. The higher the number, the better the render is going to be, but the slower it's going to render. Now the accuracy honestly doesn't really affect rendering time too harshly. So you never really have to go so high as 5,000, for example. It's just going to tag on extra rendering time, and it's not going to make much of a difference at this point in time. So doing a small number like 512, and I've been brainwashed over the years to stick with numbers of a power of 2. So you'll see me using numbers of a power of 2 like 512, 128, 1024, 4096, 2048, and so on and so forth. So it's a side effect of working with computers for too long. It'll probably happen to you too, if it hasn't already. Okay, so I'm going to stick with 512, which is a very small accuracy setting. Then we have a photon search radius. The photon search radius is going to control the size of our photons. So for example, right now the default is 2.5. If I knock this down to 0.5, watch what happens to the photons hitting the walls. They become smaller, and we can actually start to see the individual photons in our scene a lot better than before. If I knock this to something really small, I'm really going to be able to see those individual photons, and you can see them. They look like little stars or something in a space scene, just bouncing around, hitting everything. Okay, so, I mean, the search radius changes the size of the photons. Yeah, big deal, buddy. But what exactly do they do under the hood? Well, the search radius controls the accuracy of your global illumination. So what am I talking about, accuracy? Well, it's a little bit hard to explain if you don't see it in action. So I'm just going to give you an overview right now, and you'll start to understand it as we explore global illumination further and further. Now, the lower the number, the more accurate your global illumination calculation is going to be. But the longer it's going to take to render, and the more photons you're going to need. So if you're using a very small radius, like say 2.5 or even 1, you're going to end up with a very splotchy, nasty effect like this. And the only way to really fix it is to add more and more photons. So when you have a scene that looks like this, and you're using a small search radius, and it's looking really bad like this, it's a clear symptom. Mental ray is basically telling you, look, we need more photons to fill in these gaps where there just aren't enough photons hitting. Because in real life, a light would emit millions of photons. Right now, this light's only emitting 100,000, which is a very, very tiny number of photons, to be honest with you. So let's increase that to 750,000, which is 3/4 of a million photons, and we're going to see a pretty big difference here, both in render times. Our render times are going to slow down, and you can see that they are slowing down. But when this finishes rendering, it's actually going to look a lot better. So you can see it really is taking its time to render there. And there we go. Now you can see there's less splotching, but we still have splotching in effect. And that's because our radius is so small. But I don't want you to think that, oh, the radius is small? Okay, let's just crank that sucker up and get ourselves a better result. You do not want to do that. Let me show you what happens when we increase the search radius. But first, let me knock down this number of photons because 750,000 is taking too long to render. Okay, so let's go with 100,000, which renders a lot faster. Now, this is what it looks like at a search radius of 1. Let me save that image in. Now let me crank that thing up all the way to the max that the slider lets me to, which is 20. Watch what happens. Oh, we get a pretty nice smooth result. Look at that. Here's before and here's after. So you're probably thinking, wait a minute. Why would I want to use a smaller search radius to get a more accurate result if it's going to take longer to render and it's going to require more photons? When I could just put only 100,000 photons so it renders faster and just smooth this thing out with a super big search radius like 20. I'll tell you why that's not going to work. When you have a search radius that's too big, you're kind of cheating and telling mental ray, look, sacrifice the accuracy of the render in exchange for speed. And that's not a good thing to do, because right now this may look pretty good. I mean, we could see the corners of the room, and it's where the walls meet the floor and the walls meet the ceiling and the walls meet each other. But if this room was populated with objects like furniture, TVs, chairs, sofas, beds, dressers, whatever, everything is going to look disgustingly horrible, and your global illumination effect is going to be so bad that you're going to have to not use it because it's just going to hurt your render's quality. Now, obviously, it's hard to see that now because we don't have any objects in this scene. After we're done with this set of videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to another scene where we're actually going to practice doing this lighting setup in an actual real scene that has furniture and different objects in it. So right now it's kind of hard to see that, but you'll see it in action a little bit later. For now though, you're just going to have to take my word for it and trust me on that. Large search radii are bad. Small search radii are good. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, do you really have to use a small search radius like 1? No, you don't have to. And I honestly don't recommend that you do unless you have the rendering power and the patience to sit there and let it render. Me personally, I have found over the years that a search radius of 5 or lower is good. So if I switch this to 5, I'm actually going to get a pretty good result, as you can see. Let me go ahead and clear that one out. As you can see, this looks almost as smooth as when we had the search radius all the way up to 20. Of course, there's a little bit of splotching, and that can be fixed if we just add maybe twice as many photons, which is still not going to take that long to render. It's going to take a little bit longer, don't get me wrong, but it's going to render still pretty fast. As you can see right there, it rendered pretty quick. And that's a pretty small search radius. Once we get near production settings, we want to go ahead and start to increase this filter up to increase the quality. If you increase the filter and you notice that the quality really doesn't change, It's a symptom that's telling you you need more photons. But usually, for a production render, you never really have to go above um, 4,000 or 4096 in my case to stick with a number that's a power of 2. It's going to tag on a little bit more rendering time, but it may just improve the quality of the render if you have enough photons, that is. So I'm going to go ahead and knock this back down to say 1024, which is about double the default. Okay, so that takes care of those two main settings, which are going to control the quality of the render. Now let me go ahead and show you something else that's pretty neat here. I'm going to collapse this PPG to get out of the way. The rebuild option, let me turn that off for now. What that does, it tells Mental Ray to freeze the global illumination map into place. So remember I said global illumination maps would make more sense later? That's where it's going to make sense right now. The global illumination map is basically a map of your scene that Mental Ray uses to decide where the global illumination points are and how they light up your scene. Think of it as remembering the global illumination calculation. Mental Ray is going to do that behind the scenes, and this is how you turn it on and off. If you turn it off, every time we move around our camera, the render region will update, but did you notice something really cool? It didn't take the time to calculate the global illumination, yet the effect is still there. That's because when you do global illumination, the effect is scene based, meaning that the effect is calculated for your entire scene. So when we freeze it in place by unchecking rebuild, the mapping or the global illumination values stay in the scene frozen, so they don't need to be calculated over and over again. So this is perfect if you're doing an animation. You can calculate a very nice global illumination calculation that takes a long time to render. Then you can freeze it in place and save out the map and just use it over and over again. So very cool, very awesome freedom and abilities that Mental Ray gives you right there. Okay. Now we have a few other settings down here, like the trace depth settings. These settings are going to control the global illumination photons in a few different ways. We have reflection rays, we have refraction rays. These are going to control the reflection rays of the global illumination and the refraction rays and how many times they can compute that. So for example, if we have 10 reflection rays, this means that the global illumination photons can reflect in our scene a maximum of 10 times and no more. This is of course to stop the global illumination effect from calculating over and over again and reflecting all over the place, sort of how it works in real life. So we limit it. That way our render times are actually cut shorter. Now the refraction is simply the refraction rays, which are rays that are getting refracted to materials such as glass or water, things like that, transparent objects basically. The combined trace depth setting here is a combination of the two. So if these are both set to 10 and 10, you probably want this to be set at 20, though it doesn't have to. You can actually set it higher to 30, 40, 50, whatever you want. Now the rule of thumb is don't set the combined ray trace depth to lower than the reflection and refraction sum. In other words, if the sum of these two down here, the reflection and refraction is say 10, this can be 10 or higher, but it can't be lower than 10. So you can't have a combined setting of 5 and then have reflection and refraction both set to 10, because those add up to 20 and 5 obviously is lower than 20. So don't do that. Okay? Down here we have photon volume accuracy. They control the photon calculations when you're working with volumetric lights and things like that. But we're not going to get into that now. And that pretty much covers the overall settings here for controlling this quality. And if you wanted this to look even better, or you're not satisfied with these results of the global illumination map, what we can do is just check on rebuild again, go to our spotlight here, and start to increase the global illumination. Now again, if you're using global illumination to light up your scene, you're going to be using very, very high numbers. However, that's not exactly true. That's only true if you're using global illumination in your scene by itself. However, Mental Ray has a few other tricks up its sleeves which we're going to explore further in this tutorial. And once you see what I'm talking about, you're going to find out that you can use other features of Mental Ray to speed up the rendering of global illumination and to make it look even better. But we're not going to get into that now. We'll take it one step at a time. Okay? Now I'm going to end this one here, And in the next video, we're actually going to open up a real world scene where we'll get to pretend, like if you can actually go ahead and pretend you're a guy working at a studio on an actual scene that a modeler sent out to you, and you're gonna have to light it up. But I'll walk you through it, and I'll take you by the hand and show you how to light up that scene and make it look photorealistic. So I'll see you in the next video.